Very low Earth orbit satellites, known as VLEOs, have become important in a variety of surveillance and imaging applications. Trouble is, they're so low they don't stay up very long without propulsion to keep them up, and eventually they run out of fuel. Well, that's a problem the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency is trying to solve with a program known as Otter. For details, DARPA Program Manager Sarah Popkin joins me in studio. Dr. Popkin, good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
And let's begin with VLEOs. What does it mean? Are they different from regular LEOs, low Earth orbit? And what are they generally used for? And are there a lot of them?
So the biggest difference between, let's say, other spacecraft and VLEO spacecraft is the fact that they cannot ignore atmospheric drag. It is something that they have to face constantly. They have to face it at magnitudes greater than a typical, let's say, low Earth orbit or LEO satellite. So in order to overcome that drag, you need some kind of propulsion. You need some fuel to feed that propulsion system. But eventually, if you want to operate at durations, let's say on the typical 5 to 10 year timeline for satellites, you need a lot of fuel, so much so that it really becomes impractical. So there are some VLEO satellites there, but they're at somewhat the upper range of VLEO altitudes, and so they're sort of starting to address the drag problem with onboard fuel. But so far as I'm aware, there's no other air-breathing electric propulsion system that actually harvests air like we're trying to do.
Right, we'll get to that. So the idea, though, is that to get them to stay up as long as the electronics will last, you need enough fuel. So the fuel becomes the limiting factor. It becomes uneconomic, I guess. If they're always crashing and burning in the atmosphere, you got to replace them a lot.
Correct. You would have to replace them quite frequently. So it becomes a cost problem, basically. If you had to constantly throw up another one, you'd have to deal with launch costs, new satellites. It starts to break the bank.
And there's been a lot of commercial activity in low Earth orbit and in VLEO satellite launches. But if DARPA is involved, it sounds like the government is also in this space of space, let's say.
Yeah, correct. So DARPA is in the game of VLEO, but we also work with the Air Force Research Laboratory. So they are very interested in very low Earth orbit as well.
All right. So your project, Otter, is a way to give these VLEOs engines that self-propel based on the air that's in the atmosphere at that height?
Yes. So the way Otter is set up, so it's all about developing air-breathing electric propulsion so that we don't have to carry our fuel, but we can actually collect the sparse ambient air that is around us and direct that air to a thruster, essentially an electric propulsion thruster. So that's how Otter is set up, trying to collect the air and also feed it into a thruster that can survive the air environment. So another challenge with VLEO is that there's this nasty particle called atomic oxygen out there that loves to eat away at any component, especially if it's a warm component. It just is eager to find a friend, and sometimes that bond is not a friendly bond, and it starts to eat away at materials.
What we used to call rust.
Yeah, rust for space rust.
All right. Well, air breathing, I mean, every engine is air breathing because you have combustion, you need oxygen. So what do you envision actually happening in this process to create propulsion without fuel?
So I'll make a clarification. So in space electric propulsion, there is no combustion. Air-breathing engines that we experience on the ground, such as with, if you're on a flight going across the country, or if you're a ramjet or a scramjet, then yes, you're going to collect air, you're going to mix it with fuel, and that air will sustain enough pressure to create heat, and then you get combustion and it comes out the back end and makes thrust. There is just not enough air in VLEO to sustain any kind of what we would consider chemical combustion. So this air-breathing electric propulsion, it's just that. It's electric propulsion. So you provide the air into a thruster and you ionize it. So you turn it into pluses and minuses. And then once it's ionized, then you can start exerting, let's say, a magnetic force or electric field on those ionized particles, and it forces it out the back end, and that's how you get thrust. The challenge with air is that if you're familiar with a periodic table, it's kind of high up. It's nitrogen and oxygen, so it's kind of high up on the periodic table, which means that its electrons are really close, which means that it's hard to force those electrons off, so it's harder to ionize it, essentially. Compared to traditional space propellants, which are krypton and xenon, they're much lower, easier to ionize, so you don't need to dump as much electricity into the air or into the propellant in order to get your thrust. So that's another challenge of the air-breathing electric propulsion is not only how do you collect the air, but also how you efficiently ionize it, because it's just physics. It's hard to ionize.
Got it. We're speaking with Dr. Sarah Popkin. She's a program manager in the Tactical Technology Office at DARPA. And every system has friction. And so you're not trying to develop a perpetual motion machine in space, correct?
Correct. There is definitely an art to designing a low-drag spacecraft. This is an interesting domain. Me being an aerospace engineer, I was trained on Bernoulli's principle, airfoils, things like that, continuum flow. But as you get higher and higher altitude, you're no longer, Bernoulli does not apply. And you
can't fly the barn door with enough thrust.
Exactly. I love that phrase. So you need to think differently about how you design your spacecraft. That's your air particles are more like billiard balls, or I like to call them like bouncy balls. They're basically so far apart from each other that they only interact with the surfaces on the spacecraft. And we are an area of research that I'm interested in is called gas surface interactions. And it's essentially looking at, okay, your bouncy ball hits the surface. Is it going to bounce back like kind of when you throw a football at the ground and you don't know which way it's going to go? And when it comes back at you, it incurs the most drag. Or is it going to be very smooth and it's going to bounce right off? And then you have very low drag. And then there's, of course, how skinny can you be, basically? The skinnier you are in VLEO, the lower drag you can achieve.
Well, what's the programmatic approach to getting this research and development done and prototypes built? Is it through grants to companies trying to accomplish this physics and chemistry?
So we have contracts with some industry performers, generally smaller businesses. And what was sort of realized in the beginning is that this is such a new type of technology that one company that's maybe very good at thrusters may not be very good at inlets, or vice versa. Or a spacecraft designer may be accustomed to a different type of challenge area than, let's say, trying to ionize air or trying to collect air. So there are unique entities participating in Otter that have unique areas of expertise, and we are funding them through, it's not a grant, it's their contracts I'm not sure what the right phrase is for the contracts, but we are working on
grant. I mean, in effect, it's a grant.
Well, so I came from AFOSR, so a grant means a very specific thing. That means fundamental research, and this is not fundamental research. This is applied research.
More in the OTA area.
Right, exactly. More in the OTA area. Exactly. Sorry, that's the right term. And so we are allowing them in this first phase to develop their technology. They are aware of each other within, proprietary boundaries, et cetera. And then ultimately going forward, if we go forward, then they would be integrated together on a single VLEO satellite.
And by the way, you mentioned inlets and ducts and so forth and the shape of the satellite. It sounds like there is a little bit of aerodynamics involved here, even though, most satellites are ungainly looking things as if they're never going to encounter wind in any way. But VLEOs, you can shape them so that they're more efficient as they move through whatever little bit of air there is?
Yes, it is. And that's actually where my aerodynamic background really starts to come in, is I know I'm accustomed to aerodynamically shaped things, and I look at a traditional satellite, and you're right, it is a gangly, boxy thing. In fact, solar panels are potentially problematic.
Right.
Solar panels are a traditional way for collecting electricity, but they may not be the best solution because you're not 100% of the time facing the sun, and if you were, you might basically turn your spacecraft into some slick aerodynamic shape and then turn it into that barn door just because you're trying to collect solar energy. So that's a challenge area. And in fact, that's one of the challenge areas. So we actually have a VLEO workshop coming up at the end of this month in September where we're going to try and encourage the community to look at other solutions for power, for satellite design, how do you make it low drag, what materials are the best to use, etc.
So I imagine NASA must be looking at this also, as well as the defense agencies and intelligence agencies that have VLEOs.
Yes, NASA is interested, although I think that most of the interest comes from the Department of Defense at this point. But NASA technology, there is definitely relevant NASA technology that's been invested in that we're looking to leverage. And so we're talking with NASA to say, hey, how far did you get with that technology? maybe it doesn't apply to what you were going to do it with, but we think it could be really awesome for what we're doing.
And by the way, this idea of air breathing and ionizing and thrusting and